Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast. If you're a property investor or developer, you might have heard someone mention CIS and perhaps wondered what that is. Well, today I'm going to give you a simple, practical overview of CIS so that you can quickly spot whether your business might need to consider it and what the process looks like if it does. CIS stands for Construction Industry Scheme. It's an HMR scheme that affects how payments are handled when you pay for construction work. The history of it goes back a long, long way in reality. When I first started working in construction 40 years ago, a lot of tradesmen were still paid cash in hand on a Friday afternoon. I can remember people turning up on site with brown envelopes to pay the tradesmen that were working on the projects. And no doubt some of that cash didn't actually get disclosed to HMRC, so huge amounts of it were lost in the system, and HMRC weren't recovering the tax, income tax, that they were perhaps recovering from salaried people like me, where it went through a process and we got paid into our bank. But it was all these cash in hand people that were just avoiding the system, as it were. So the scheme has evolved a number of times along the way, but ultimately we're now in this position where the CIS, the Construction Industry Scheme, is all about ensuring that tax for the tradesman is dealt with properly. Well, of course, now very little happens with cash anyway, so it's almost as though the current way that we operate has overtaken. But of course, we've still got this construction industry scheme in place. Just a little disclaimer to start. As you're well aware, I'm not a tax advisor or an accountant. So I'm sharing this information just to help you understand this tax a little bit better and decide if you need to take further, more specialist advice than I can give you on this podcast. And indeed, potentially more specialist advice than you might get just by actually Googling this or putting it into AI, because as you'll see in this or as you'll hear in this episode, there are a number of little nuances that you need to be aware of, and to that extent, I've actually got notes in front of me for this podcast. And many of the podcasts I do, I talk from just some basic notes, but this one I have got a little bit more written down just to make sure that I'm giving you exactly the right information. And you may need to go back and re-listen to it and actually write down some of the things that I'm talking about, particularly if you're driving or walking. There may be some key things that you need to come back to and refer to. So the basic laws, the basics rules say that if your business is treated as a CIS contractor and you pay people to carry out work on your projects, you need to understand their CIS status. So the question really is, are you a CIS contractor? Is your business treated as a CIS contractor? Because if it is, then you need to check the status of the people that you're engaging, and you may need to deduct tax from the labour element of their work, as exactly the same as you would do if you had an employee working for you, and you paid them a gross salary. You take the tax off, and then they receive the net figure. And of course, any tax you collect needs to find its way to HMRC. And there is, of course, a process for this, a reasonably good automated process. It's not something I've had to administer for a few years now, but it's a reasonably clear process that's um, not overly complicated. So the CIS is these rules that sit between you, the people doing the building work, and HMRC, which, if you fall under the rules, you cannot avoid. Now, first thing to think about here, or first thing to consider here, is how CIS comes about. Now, CIS isn't anything to do with your company name. So there's no connection with your company name and CIS. It has nothing to do with your logo or anything like that. It actually, it comes down to what you are doing. Now, what you are doing in most cases is actually set aside or noted on Companies House as the SIC code. So if you look on your business setup on Companies House, you will find at least one, possibly more, SIC codes that tell Companies House what that business does. However, the SIC code alone is not the only thing, because in many ways it comes down to what are you actually doing. Now, if what you're doing reflects your SIC code, then it's the SIC code that you can consider. The SIC, even though it's the same letters, there's no connection between SIC and CIS. SIC is standard industry classification, I think that stands for. And there's hundreds of them, possibly thousands of them, I don't know, relating to different kinds of businesses that we could operate. So if everything is aligned, then what you do will be reflected back in your SIC code. But I suspect that there's a lot of people within that are listening to this that perhaps haven't necessarily got them totally aligned, particularly if you set up with one business intent and you've moved slightly sideways. And this is where I say you do need to take some specialist advice. So but if we say that the SIC codes do set out what we're doing, they and we are operating as we've got in the SIC codes. These codes are available on the internet. They're obviously in your company's house setup. They can therefore be seen by banks, accountants, insurance companies, and any other business that needs to understand a little bit more about your business and kind of the risk of working with you and things like that, which, we're not doing high risk things here. We're not building nuclear power stations or anything. So, this is all kind of sensible things to think about. So the SIC code, which is this classification code, is your label. And as I said, a company can have more than one SIC code. Those SIC codes with a description, and I'll talk about some of those shortly, may sound pretty similar. They may be a little bit of crossover of the different elements of your business. And so it's not a problem if you've got more than one. But the key thing is some of them are more critical when it comes to CIS, the construction industry scheme, than others. So you're likely to have you're likely to have SIC codes in two categories for most of your businesses. And this is where you may just want to make some notes and refer back to these at some point. So if you have a construction related business, then those codes are going to start 4-1. They're 5-digit codes and they're going to start 4-1. So common examples are 41100, and the description of that is development of building projects. So if you are developing projects, now development generally means we are aiming to sell. Our plan at the end is sell, or our plan from beginning to end is to sell. i.e. not hold. So developers principally carry out work with the intention of selling. So that's 41100. Then there's also 41201, which is construction of commercial buildings, which some of you may be doing, but that's perhaps a little bit more specialist. But the one that kind of links up with that is 41202, which is construction of domestic buildings. So most developers would probably set themselves up as 41100 and leave it fairly vague. Development of building projects, I'm going to do anything that comes along. Some people might be set up as 41202, construction of domestic buildings. So in either of those cases, you are constructing whole buildings from scratch, normally with a view of selling, but maybe holding. It's not totally clear. Selling is definitely the development. The construction one is probably with a plan of holding, but that is constructing whole buildings. So 4.1s are definitely codes where the CIS is actually relevant. The other codes that you may have are relating to property management, real estate, that kind of business, and they start with 6.8. So common examples here are 68100, which I'm sure a lot of you have got, me included, buying and selling of own real estate. 68100. There's also 68209, other letting and operating of owned or leased real estate. I've got that as well. So I've got a business with both of those as the SIC code, because I'm buying and selling my own stuff and I'm owning and managing my own stuff as well. And then there's also, some of you may also have 68320, which is management of real estate on a fee or contract basis. So this is where you're operating a bit more like a letting agent. You may not be a letting agent with a shop in high street, but you may be managing other people's properties on their behalf in one way or another. So generally, if you've got 6.8 codes, you are considered property investment, property management, and may not be developers and builders. Where this gets a little bit grayer is that as buying and owning our own properties, we do carry out refurbishment conversion works. And this is where things do or can get a little bit grey, because the thing for the CIS is very much, are you carrying out or instructing significant construction operations? And this is where it can become a bit of a grey area, and where I would advise you to take some external advice. Just jumping in to make sure that you've got everything you need. Now, in a number of these podcasts, you'll have heard me talk about other property investors that I'm currently working with or have worked with in the past. And so I wanted to ensure that you can find out how you can actually work with me. And the best place to start with that is my website, www.refurbishmentmastery.com. On there, you'll find details of training courses that I run. You'll find details about my community, and also how you can work with me on a one-to-one basis when you are progressed far enough down the line. And then if you're not really sure what's right for you and how we can work together, then there's a button at the top. Just hit the button at the top that says book a call. It's absolutely free. It will take you to my diary, find a slot, and we'll be able to talk in the next couple of weeks. Remember, the website is refurbishmentmastery.com. I really look forward to helping you with a successful delivery of all of your projects. Now back to the podcast. So Generally, it's assumed that CIS only relates to building companies, developments. But if you're doing significant works, and what's the definition of significant works? Well, to some extent, it's whatever HMRC want it to be. It could suddenly become relevant for you. So, I would think if you're remember if you're creating a whole new dwelling, i.e., you've got a commercial building and you're converting it into a number of flats, then you are definitely acting as a developer or a contractor or construction in that situation. So, i.e., the code's beginning with 4.1. Whereas if you're refurbishing an existing property, I think probably even converting a house to an HMO at the lower end of things, that all fits under 6.8. Uh, and that's where I've been. Apart from a very early couple of projects I did many years ago in a joint venture in joint venture arrangements where we were definitely creating additional dwellings. Everything else I've done has really just been refurbishing things that have already been there, and fairly low key things more recently for myself. I have worked with a lot of developers, of course, that have been managing the CIS as well. So the key thing here is you just need to be careful that you don't trip into a developer or a constructor of new buildings and assume that because you've got a CIS code starting in 6.8, CIS isn't appropriate. CIS can become appropriate because technically you've got the wrong SIC code, and technically you should be changing the SIC code. And of course, if you change the SIC code, HMRC are going, they probably get a notification that it's been changed. Certainly, if you set a company up from scratch with an SIC code where it's relevant, I think HMRC probably do get a notification. I did this many years ago when I set up my building contracting business. I was registered for CIS tax absolutely immediately because I knew as a builder that's what I needed to do. So yeah, just tread carefully there. Be a little bit careful. That when does small repairs and maintenance suddenly trip into major works, and big alteration projects and things like that. So just be a little bit careful with what you're doing. Um, Keep your SIC codes up to date. You should be reviewing those on an annual basis anyway, but you may have outsourced that to a third party, to an accountant, and they may not be asking to verify those. But when you do your annual statements, check that your SIC codes are right. Check that you're still operating in line with what you say you're doing, and think about the projects that you're doing and just consider whether you are constructing or developing new property, and whether your minor refurbishments are starting to get into major construction works. And that's the grey area really, because it's not totally clear what the definition of that is. So the other thing you perhaps just need to be aware of is who is paying for what, because even if you are managing things for another client, if you are paying for some of that work, let's say, and I know there's some people that offer the one-stop shops effectively. They find investors, they find properties for those investors, and they manage the process of the conversion, and all of the money goes through their system. You need to be very careful that you haven't tripped into the position of being considered to be a developer or a contractor. So take some advice on all of that, because that's when things start to get a little bit more complex, and you need to be careful that you've not made a mistake. The CIS process, very simply, for anyone that falls under these regulations, it's not only difficult, not overly difficult. So if you are deemed to be responsible for CIS. Effectively, you fall under the umbrella where HMRC are saying you now have a business which has to take some responsibilities. And what you would do, you would obviously register on the system. On the HMRC website, you would get another little bit of, you get another platform added to your HMRC platform that you've probably already got. You just open up another little gateway in there. And what you need to do is you need, before you employ anyone to do any construction work, you need to verify where that supplier and although supplier is the word HMRC used, by supplier, we're talking builders and contractors. You need to verify where they sit with their own status. And they're going to have two statuses, basically. One is they are not registered under the scheme, or two is they are registered under the scheme. Well, with number two, if they are registered under the scheme, you don't need to do anywhere near as much paperwork as if they're not registered under the scheme. Because if they're registered under the scheme, effectively you've passed the responsibility for much of the management further down the line. There is still some paperwork you need to do, but if they're registered, you pass it on down the line. And most bona fide building contracting businesses will be registered. So for a lot of it, it's relative. A lot of us, it's relatively easy. We pass it down the line to the registered contractor that's working for us. If they're not registered, which could be the case with some new businesses, some small businesses, businesses that have come predominantly out of the domestic market, and have probably skirted under the radar, to be honest, they're the ones that you may need to manage in a slightly different way. So, and in this case, you need to get an invoice from them which shows two figures. It doesn't matter how the invoice is built up, you do that completely separately. But when you get the invoice from them, they need to show the labor element of the work as a separate line item. It doesn't, you don't need a breakdown of that figure. All you need to do, and to be honest, you don't even need to verify that it's accurate. And what you'll find is that some builders will manipulate that and weight it accordingly, because they tell you how much is the labor element. And what you have to then do is you record on your HMRC platform that you have that you've engaged this contractor, they've sent you an invoice, this amount of money was labor, and because you are now responsible for withholding the tax, you take that tax from them and you send that on to HMRC, and you pay your contractor the net amount. So a contractor that is CIS registered themselves, they will invoice you the full amount that you've agreed to pay them. You pay them the full amount. They then will consider and deal with CIS at their level for their subcontractors. And probably they'll end up managing all of that themselves. They'll have a process in-house to do that. As I say, it's not overly onerous to do. And you can pay them gross. If they're not registered, then you need to pay them net, and you need to forward that tax deduction onto HMRC, and you've got a timeline to be able to do that. Now, even if your contractor is registered, the fact that you're registered for CIS still means that every month you have to submit a return. So you're registered as a business. Every month you're carrying out work, you must register a return. Even if the people that you're engaging are all registered for CIS themselves, you would effectively submit what we'd call a nil return, i.e., I've engaged this contractor, they're registered, we've verified all of that, so there's a nil return. So you do have this little bit of process to do, and there are some set dates where you've got to submit this return by, and you've got to, and then there's a set date by which point you've got to pay the VAT on. Your bookkeeper will easily be able to manage that little process for you. I wouldn't give it to an accountant. You're paying a premium for a service that isn't really as I say, bookkeeper absolutely every day of the week. You could probably even get a VA to do this for you. It's not a complex thing at all. It's just about having it in the diary as a regular thing and making sure that it gets done, as a system every single month. So just watch out, what codes you've got and whether it's applicable for you. Don't assume that just because you're a landlord means that it doesn't apply, because it can, and you can be doing works that are outside what you actually are. And although SIC codes on companies' houses are a really good indication, it's not the be all and end all. And ultimately, if you get this wrong and HMRC find out, they'll come back after you for back tax, probably some interest on all of that. There may be a fine as well, depending on how the circumstances came about. And the worst case is that if you've engaged a contractor and failed to take the tax correctly, and HMRC come after you in 3 years' time, and 3 years' time, you can't actually find the contractor that you've paid the tax to. Ultimately, you've got to pay all of that shortfall from your own funds. So you do want to be careful that you don't get this wrong. So this is a pretty simple overview. It's not an overly complicated process. You will find it online, although you will find some misinformation online. So do be careful. Definitely something to talk to your tax advisor and accountant about. And as I say, if you've got a bookkeeper that knows construction and things like that, then they'll be really up to speed with what's going on here. As I said, I'm not a tax advisor, so do take your own advice. But hopefully this episode has just given you an overview to something that you'll hear going on, hear mentioned, and perhaps didn't know anything about previously. Thanks very much for listening. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.